Hello, friends. How are you? I've brought a beautiful story for you, and honestly, I wrote this story based on a story by a great Middle Eastern writer named Sadek Hedayat. You could say this story is a rewriting of that story in a way that is compatible with your culture and easier to understand. This story, The Return Home. In 1964, a bakery, a butcher shop, a spice store, two cafes, and a barbershop made up the environment square. Everyone, under the scorching afternoon summer sun, half burned, longed for the first evening breeze and shade before sunset. People, shops, animals, and even the trees were exhausted. No one had any energy for movement. A soft layer of dust waved in front of the azure sky, which thickened with the constant movement of a few cars. On one side of the square, there was an ancient sycamore tree, with its hollow trunk decayed. But, with complete stubbornness, it had spread its crooked branches, forming a wide, large platform under the shade of its dusty leaves. Two boys were selling syrup and sunflower seeds there. A thick, muddy stream sluggishly flowed in front of the cafe. The only noticeable building was the famous Veriman Tower, whose large clock showed 4:45. The sparrows, which had nested in the cracks of the crumbling bricks of the tower, were silent and drowsy from the heat. The sound of a dog's whimper occasionally broke the silence. It was a Scottish dog, with black spots on its legs, as if it had run through a swamp. Its droopy ears, shiny tail, curly fur, and two intelligent eyes gleamed from its shaggy face. In the depths of its eyes, a human soul could be seen, carrying a message that couldn't be understood. Two hazel eyes full of pain, suffering, and anticipation, which could only be seen in the face of a wandering dog. It seemed that no one saw or understood its pitiful, pleading gaze. At that time and place, in the culture of those people who had been ravaged by the invasion of foreign Arabs 1,300 years ago and whose influence was still evident, people, according to the 1,300-year-old Arab culture, did not get along well with dogs. In front of the bakery, an apprentice was beating it. In front of the butcher shop, the apprentice was throwing stones at it. If it sought refuge in the shadow of a car, the driver's heavy shoe kicked it, and tormenting the dog was the pastime of the syrup-selling boys. When the Arabs invaded their country, they had forcibly changed the beliefs of their ancestors with the sword, and those dogmatic beliefs had been passed down to future generations. In those vile beliefs, innocent dogs were considered ominous. The animal, forced to flee down an alley towards the tower, dragged itself with its empty stomach and took refuge in a small stream. It laid its head on its paws, stuck out its tongue to cool off, and stared at the green alfalfa field in front of it. Its body was exhausted, and its nerves were in pain. In the damp air of the stream, a unique comfort spread through its body. The various scents of the half-dead plants revived distant, tangled memories. Each time it approached the grass, memories of the past filled its mind. It longed to romp in the greenery. This instinct was inherited, as all its ancestors had freely grown up in the Scottish grasslands.
I don't know why, people, this is how they treat me. I want nothing but love.
It remembered how it always felt obliged to respond to its master's call, to drive away strangers or foreign dogs from its master's house, to play with the master's child, and to be peaceful with familiar people. It ate on time, expected affection at specific times, but now it had none of these. Its entire focus had become scavenging from trash with fear and trembling, getting beaten all day, and howling in pain. It had once been brave, fearless, clean, and lively, but now it had become scared and beaten down. Any sound it heard or any movement near it made it tremble. Its body itched, and it couldn't muster the energy to lick itself. For 2 summers, it had been stuck in this hell-hole. 2 summers had passed since it had eaten a full meal, had a good sleep, its desires and feelings had been suppressed, and not a single person had patted it on the head. No one had looked into its eyes, even though the people here resembled its master, but it seemed the emotions, morals, and behavior of its master were as different from them as heaven and earth. Its master was an authentic Iranian, rooted in the ancient culture of Iran. The people it had once been close to understood its pains and emotions better. The people in this square acted like Arabs from 1,300 years ago. It remembered that the master's son had been its playmate. It would run after him in the garden, bark and bite at his clothes. It especially remembered the pats from its master and the sugar cubes it had eaten from his hand. But it loved the master's son the most because he was its playmate and had never scolded it. It loved its master, his son, his wife, and their servant. It recognized the scent of each of them. It remembered walking around the dining table at meal times, sniffing the food. Sometimes the master's wife, despite her husband's disapproval, would sneak a bite of love and affection for it. Then the servant would come and call, "Pat, Pat," and pour its food into a special dish near its wooden kennel. The dog knew what had caused its misfortune. The memory of that bitter day remained in its mind. Its master had not allowed it to leave the house to chase female dogs. One spring day, by chance, the master called Pat, along with 2 others who Pat knew, as they often visited their house. They called Pat into the car. Pat had traveled with its master by car several times before, but that day it had a special excitement and anxiety. After a few hours on the road, they arrived at that same square and got out. The master and the others walked past the alley by the tower and talked to a few people. Pat caught the scent of a female dog. It was overwhelmed with desire. The scent of the female dog drove it crazy. It jumped out of the car and sniffed in different places until it finally entered a garden through a water path. After a while, it heard its master calling, "Pat, Pat." Although it should have quickly returned at the sound of its master's voice, lust and instinct had overcome it. It felt as though its ears had become deaf to the sounds of the outside world. The scent of the female dog was so strong that it felt intoxicated. Its muscles, body, and senses no longer obeyed it. It searched for the female dog in the garden. But, as bad luck would have it, the gardener of that garden, with the same backward foreign culture, greeted it with a stick and shovel, shouting. In terror, Pat fled through the garden's water path. Within seconds, all the lust was gone, replaced only by trembling fear. Terrified, Pat came to its senses and started searching for its master. In several alleys, a faint scent of its master remained. It checked them all and marked the spots at regular intervals. It went out of town to a wasteland and then returned. In the square, the weak scent of its master was lost among other smells. Had its master left and abandoned it? A sense of anxiety and terror gripped it. How could Pat live without its master? Its master was like a god to it. But at the same time, it was sure that its master would come looking for it. Terrified, it started running down the road. But its efforts were in vain. By nightfall, exhausted, it returned to the square. There was no sign of its master. It made a few more rounds of the village. Finally, it went to the water path where the scent of the female dog was, but the path had been blocked with stones. Pat eagerly dug at the ground with its paws, hoping to enter the garden, but it was impossible. After losing hope, it lay down and started dozing off. In the middle of the night, Pat woke up startled. It hurriedly got up, passed through several alleys, and returned to the square. The smell of various food wafted in the air. Someone who had been staring at Pat left and shortly returned with a piece of bread in hand, saying, "Come, come." The sound seemed strange to its ears, but they threw a warm piece of bread in front of it. After some hesitation, Pat ate the bread and wagged its tail for the person. The person placed the rest of the bread on a platform and cautiously, with fear, patted Pat on the head. Then, with both hands, they removed Pat's collar. Pat felt such relief. It was as if all the responsibilities, restraints, and duties had been lifted from its neck. But as soon as it wagged its tail again and approached the shopkeeper, a strong kick hit its side, and it ran away whining.
I want nothing but love. I have a heart like you. I cry with sadness and happiness. I just want a little love.
After a year and a half from that cursed day, Pat still recognized his collar, which was hanging in front of that man's shop. Since that day, Pat had received nothing from these people but kicks, stones, and blows from clubs. It was as if they were all his blood enemies and enjoyed torturing him. In this year and a half, Pat had been beaten more than he had been fed. From his past life, only a handful of vague, blurry memories and a few cents remained for him, and whenever he went through a particularly hard time, those memories would involuntarily come to his mind. What tortured Pat the most was his need for affection. His eyes begged for this affection. He needed to express his kindness to someone. That water stream was his constant refuge and a reminder of his memories.
I had good friends before, they loved me. I wish all people were as good as them. I'm tired, I'm hungry, and my soul hurts. I have hope for tomorrow to love.
As Pat was dozing off in the stream, he felt a sharp hunger. The smell of kebab coming from the square tortured him. He struggled to his feet and cautiously headed towards the square. As always, he was welcomed with stones. Disheartened, he turned towards the road. Just then, a car came from Verriman Square. A stranger got out of the car and walked towards Pat. Pat kept his distance. The man sat down and said, "Come, come." Pat stopped. The man slowly approached him. Pat hesitated whether to stay or flee. The man gently stroked the animal's head. This man didn't smell like his owner at all. But how had someone appeared who was petting him? Could this be a trick? Pat wagged his tail and looked at the man with uncertainty. Had he been fooled? But there was no collar on his neck anymore for him to be petted. The man returned to his car. Pat followed him. The man took out some fragrant food from the car and placed it in front of Pat. Pat ate in a rush at first, then more slowly. His beautiful, helpless hazel eyes gazed at the man in gratitude, wagging his tail. Was he awake, or was he dreaming? Pat ate his fill of food without it being interrupted by beatings. Could it be that he had found a new owner? The man stroked Pat's head once more and then got into the car. Pat didn't dare to climb in, so he sat next to the car, watching him. Suddenly, the car started moving amidst a cloud of dust, and Pat immediately began running after it. No, this time he didn't want to lose this man. He panted, and despite the pain he felt in his body, he ran as fast as he could after the car. The car moved away from the village and passed through the desert. Pat caught up to the car 2 or 3 times, but then fell behind again. He had gathered all his strength, but the car was faster than him. He was exhausted and broken. All his efforts were in vain. He didn't know where he was going. Neither had a way back nor forward. He stopped, panting, his tongue hanging out. His vision grew dark. With his head hanging low, he struggled to drag himself off the road and lay down in a stream beside a field, resting his belly on the damp sand. He felt a sharp pain in his stomach. A while later, 3 hungry crows were circling above Pat. One of them cautiously landed near him, carefully watching him. As soon as it was sure Pat wasn't dead, it flew away again. Pat, still young, didn't want to be defeated by the crows. With difficulty, he got up and slowly made his way back to Varriman. He hoped that one day his owner would return to Varriman.
I don't know why people, this is how they treat me. I want nothing but love. I have a heart like you. I cry with sadness and happiness. I just want a little love.